Okay, right. So I'm just going to be looking just a few slides on the environmental impact of meat and dairy and asking the question, can our planet sustain our consumption of meat and dairy? I'll be looking particularly at the lens, mostly at the lens through the lens of climate change, but that's not the only thing. I'll come back and talk about some of the other environmental impacts later. So to start off with just a few facts and figures, a quarter of global emissions, greenhouse gas emissions that is, come from the food sector. So when we think about climate change, you often hear on the news and you sort of think it's all about transport, it's all about energy generation. But what many people don't realise is that over a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions that we emit on the planet come from the food system through feeding ourselves. Now, of these food sector emissions, a whopping 58% come from animal products. So that's more than half of these emissions come from animal products, despite animal products making up only a small part of our consumption in terms of either calories or protein and the other micro and macronutrients. So they have a disproportionate impact on emissions. And when we look in detail at the animal products that cause these emissions, over half of those emissions, or around about half, are from beef and lamb alone. So beef and lamb alone account for 50% of all the emissions from animal products. Now, it's not just sort of a niche sort of view that we need to reduce our consumption of livestock products and to reduce food waste. The UK Committee on Climate Change, which advises the UK government, says that we need to cut meat and dairy consumption by at least 20% and to reduce waste by 20%. So the chief executive, Chris Stark, told in an interview, said that we can't meet the government's net 2050 net zero target without major changes to the way that we use land, the way that we farm, and the way that we eat. So, why is this? And how does diet make a difference? If we look at the greenhouse gas intensity of different food products, I plotted them out here. This is from a life cycle. This is from life cycle assessments of all the products. What you can see here over in the top end is all these emissions are expressed in kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of product. And what you can see here is that for example, we take beef and sheep. These have greenhouse gas emissions of 50 to 60 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of product. If we look over on the right-hand side, we see the meat substitutes and the pulses and beans, and these have a climate impact that's about 10 to 100 times less than that of ruminant foods. So, and you've got the white meats and the other monogastric meats sort of sitting somewhere in the middle, higher than vegetable products, but less than the ruminants. The reason the ruminants have such a high climate impact is because of the methane that's emitted through their digestion in a process called enteric fermentation. So when they digest food anaerobically, it produces methane, and the methane is then burped out by the ruminants. And that methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, short-lived, but nevertheless a very potent greenhouse gas. So the idea of dietary shifts is that if we shift more of the food that we eat in category A over here, we shift towards more of those foods in category B, we reduce our climate impact by reducing the amount of these very high carbon intensity foods. It's as simple as that. If we look at all of the diets together, we can. This was a meta-analysis by Alexandrovich et al. In 2016, and this looked at the effects of reducing greenhouse gas emissions relative to a standard diet. And as you can see, the vegan diet produces the greatest cut in greenhouse gas emissions, about 40 to 50% less emissions from a vegan diet. A vegetarian diet, about 30% less greenhouse gas emissions. A Mediterranean diet, about 10 to 20%, and even a reduced meat diet giving about 10%. Now, the main thing to take away from this is that we don't, although vegan diets have the lowest climate impact, we can make a big difference by just reducing the amount of meat and dairy that we consume. We don't have to go all the way to a once in a lifetime binary decision. I'm never going to eat meat and dairy again. A few people are willing to do that, but not everybody is. But everybody can make a decision to cut the amount of meat and dairy that they eat, maybe by cutting portion sizes, maybe by having a meat-free day, or just including meat and dairy in less meals, or by switching a certain amount of your intake of dairy, to example, to milk alternatives such as oat milk. So everybody can make a difference. It's not just vegans versus meat eaters. Everybody can make a difference by reducing the amount of meat and dairy that they consume. It makes a big difference on our own individual climate footprint. So I just did some calculations with a carbon footprint calculator here. And I put in no other emissions at all, apart from the emissions from the diet. A vegan diet has a climate impact of about 0.88 tons of CO2 equivalents per year. A heavy meat diet has a CO2 equivalence emissions of 2.2 tons of CO2 per year. The difference between a vegan diet and the heavy meat diet actually is about 1.32 tons of CO2 equivalents per year. And that's the equivalent of 2 return flights from Edinburgh to Malaga. So a really massive difference. People talk about flying and flight shame and those sorts of things. But this is 2 flights from Edinburgh to Malaga. So basically 2 summer holidays per person is the equivalent that you get by reducing the amount of meat and switching to a vegan diet. In fact, when you compare it to the total emissions that an individual needs to meet the net zero targets, a global average of 2 tons of CO2 per year, CO2 equivalents per year, is what is needed to reach an equitable distribution of greenhouse gas emissions for everybody on the planet. A heavy meat diet alone exceeds that. So if you're eating a heavy meat diet, you're eating more than your fair share of greenhouse gas emissions, but that's not even taking into account transport, heating your home, the electricity you use, and all the other things that you emit in your daily lives. Your diet alone will be pushing you over that global fair average. So I would argue that particularly in developed countries, it's the fair and just and equitable thing to reduce our meat and dairy consumption to meet our global targets for climate change. But it's not only climate change. This is from Michael Clark and Dave Tillman's paper in 2017, where they looked at the impact of different food products on a range of different environmental indicators. So climate change is the one that I've shown before. Again, it's showing that ruminant meat up here is about nearly 100 times worse than maize, wheat and rice, these cereals down here. So a massive climate impact, but I've already covered that. But we also find when we look at land use, when we look at energy use, when we look at the impacts on air quality and the impacts on water quality, the impact is 100 times worse from those ruminant meat products, compared to the plant-based foods. So this reiterates the need for shifting our consumption away from meat and dairy, because it will also free up land, we would use less energy, and it would cause less water and air pollution. So all of these environmental indicators push in the same direction, saying that we need to eat less meat and less ruminant meat in particular. There's good examples of links between environmental sustainability and human health. So as noted in this paper by Tillman and Clark, the incidence of type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease and chronic non-communicable diseases, which give a global lower life expectancies, are associated with the overconsumption of processed meat and red meat in particular. And also with the higher consumption of red and processed meats are also indicative of increases in risk of colorectal cancer. There's an 18% increase associated with consumption of these products. So that's equivalent to about an increase of 1 in 100 people. So it's not only better for the planetary health, but it's also better for individual human health to cut the consumption of these products in those countries that are over-consuming them. The last thing I'd mention is that reducing animal product consumption, because of the large amounts of land and water that it uses, as well as the greenhouse gas emissions, reducing animal product consumption creates the headspace to use less intensive forms of agriculture. This was a study where we looked at whether we could feed the world organically. And we find that we just about can, but we can't do it with current or projected consumption patterns. We need to reduce the consumption of animal products and eliminate animal feeds that could be fed to humans. If we were to switch away from those two things, then we could feed the world organically. So I'm not saying that we should do that, but it's just an example that it allows us to reimagine the food system, to reimagine the way that we do agriculture, and we could do it in an entirely different, less intensive, less factory farming way if we consumed less meat and dairy. So I'll just finish the pitch by saying that food production and distribution contributes a third of global greenhouse gas emissions, 26% on that slide that I showed, but up to a third. Livestock production is responsible for 58% of all emissions from agriculture, and half of those emissions come from ruminants such as cattle and sheep. Ruminant meat has 10 to 100 times worse impact on the climate than plant-based foods, as well as a 10 to 100 times worse impact on land use, water use, air pollution and water pollution. So I would contend that we need to redesign the food system to produce food that's healthy and sustainable, so better for the planet and better for humans. This will mean lower meat consumption and halving food loss and waste, and it'll improve efficiency of production. So I would say if you want to make a difference, eat less meat and dairy and eat more fruit and veg. I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks, Pete. That was a really good overview of us trying to look at reasons to eat less meat. So, Michael, can I pass on to you and you give us your pitch?
Okay, thank you. Okay, great. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Jenny, for the invitation. So, where Peter and I definitely agree is that as a species, we have been terrible to this planet. There is no doubt. And continuing the way that we are is a pathway to destruction. And I think it's summarized very well in Rockstrom's Planetary Boundaries. The type of production systems, the type of industry, the continual rise for countries' ever increasing demand for GDP growth has driven the planet close to destruction. So status quo and business as usual is not an answer. We need to change the way that we produce food, consume food, produce products, and consume generally. And that would, but the disconnect between economic development and greenhouse gas is very difficult, and that's the thing that we need to concentrate on, which is a general emissions of greenhouse gas and strive for GDP, which is what's driving these changes. And that's possibly where Peter and I disagree, in that emphasizing the role solely on livestock as being the major driver of environmental change, I think is covering up a lot of ills. And Peter used this exact same slide by Ripple in 2014, which has been used to demonize ruminant productions as one of the major driver of climate change and greenhouse gas production. And what I think these data sets do extremely well is to get high impact publications in papers like Nature and Science. What they don't do well is actually help agricultural production to change to be more sustainable. And the major reason why I say that is what Peter indicated here are global averages, and how useful are global averages when you're talking to farmers in different parts of the world to improve their system. Meaning data across all production systems will not give you a pathway towards sustainability. So that's where I think Peter and I disagree. And just that's emphasized in this particular slide, the danger of global averages. First of all, on the left-hand side, Peter indicated that we need to have a 20% reduction in red meat. While we've been reducing red meat consumption in the UK since the 1950s, and you can see here, I've just put up two examples of consumption of lamb and chicken within the UK, and what's replaced ruminant systems, particularly within the UK, but I think this is in many countries, but I think particularly within Europe and the UK is a prime example. We're moving away from red meat consumption and our roasts towards chicken, and that shift has been really stark. And I think keep on emphasizing some of the detriments of ruminant systems is undermining rural communities, particularly, and is not a true image of what's actually happening at a country level or a region level. And that's the issue of chasing global averages. So I think that's a really important point to start off with. The second thing is, Peter mentioned the fact the average of 50 to 60 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilogram of products for beef and sheep. But that bears no resemblance to the beef and sheep we produce in the UK. And I've got some data up here which emphasises the environmental footprint classically of sheep produced in the three main systems within the UK. And then you see that our environmental impact is between 10 and 18 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents. And for permanent pasture for beef is around about 19, so a long way short of the global averages which have been stated, and therefore it's undermining more efficient production systems. And also Peter mentioned the huge impact that agriculture has on greenhouse gases. But of course, again, they're global averages. And if you look at the UK, greenhouse gas from agriculture is at 10% of our emissions. And about 2/3 of that is livestock, so about 7% of that is livestock. And we need to reduce that. Absolutely, totally agree with Peter. We need to reduce that. But just keep on using global averages, demonizing ruminant production isn't going to reduce that. What we need to do is to help improve efficiency. And one of the issues with that approach and the approach of papers like Clark and Tillman and Ripple is the fact that they use these global averages saying, well, that is set in stone. These numbers are not going to change. There's no way the industry can improve. Well, that's rubbish. We can improve, and we're looking to do that. So let's have a look at, first of all, why the livestock sector is so important to the UK. So livestock foods are an important part of human nutrition supply, and they supply high quality protein for people who choose an omnivorous diet. And, that's first and foremost. We're 60 to 70% sufficient in meat and milk and eggs. And as I've shown from the previous slide, we're extremely efficient in producing those high quality products. Also, livestock can convert lands not suitable for growing crops into high quality food. And it's an important part of our GDP. The food system within the UK pre-COVID was certainly contributing around £12 billion. And it's actually shown that during COVID, reliance on short supply chains is really important. Understanding where our food is produced and supporting local production systems is critically important. So therefore, we need to support, not undermine, rural, local production of foods. And we're very good at producing. I don't understand why my slide is missing here. But anyway, so going back to the point about counting that 50 to 60 kilograms. So the first thing is to say, well, actually, we can improve our farming systems, and we can move towards producing net zero beef, which are really, or net zero milk, and which would really undermine some of the arguments saying that the only way towards net zero is to remove livestock products, or particularly ruminant products. So there are 4 steps which I just want to highlight that the industry are working towards, and research is really pushing towards. The first one, unfortunately, I don't know why it's missing. I can't see it there on my slide, but the first one is looking at the animal. So selecting animals that are most efficient. So looking at residual feed intake, so basically lower amounts of food for higher output of product, lower levels of enteric fermentation, lower levels of nitrous oxide associated with those animals. And data from Rothamsted at the Northwick Farm Platform has shown that if we can select we remove the bottom 5% performing animals each year, which we can do through a breeding program, we year on year can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 20%. So that's just genetics selecting the best performing animals. Secondly, diet. There's many ways that you can look at diet to reduce greenhouse gas. Peter rightfully said, the reason why the higher carbon footprint for ruminant systems is associated with enteric fermentation. Well, you can look at a balanced diet, but there are also some supplements that reduce methane. They affect the microbial population in the gut, for example, which Archaea, and this product 3-NOP, which has now been developed and is for sale, has been shown to reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with methane by 30% when added to the diet. So that's another way that we can further reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Thirdly, land, and I've got a few slides on this, so I won't take long looking at it, but if we think about a beef system, we lower the emissions associated with the animal, and then we look at the surrounding environment of the farm to capture that carbon. And Peter obviously knows a lot more about this than I in terms of soil health, but that's a critical component. But we also need to look at hedgerows and trees. So we think about how we capture the carbon emissions associated with the food production as part of a circular economy, or capture. If you produce carbon, make sure you capture it on your farm. And so looking at land in livestock farms is critically important. And the final area is energy. Many farms can produce green energy, whether that's AD, whether that's solar, whether that's wind. And that needs to be a key part of every farming system. We utilize all components, as well as driving down carbon inputs, for example, inorganic fertilizers and diesels. We actually make green energy on farm. So these 4 steps can move towards a net zero beef system. There's my slide showing that data now. I don't know why it did that. So I just wanted to just emphasize some back of the cigarette packet, if you can say that, probably shouldn't say that anymore, calculation of how a beef farm could move towards net zero. So if you take this little example here, I've got my little beef animal here producing 50 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. So how much trees would we have to grow within this farm to be able to offset that methane and take full example of the great nutrients that it provides? So I've got taken a farm about 20 hectares, a stocking rate of about 1.5 livestock units per hectare, about 30 finishing suckler cattle on this farm, then finishing them about 60 kilograms of live weight, each of these animals producing 15 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. So this is the graph. So we've got the baseline here in terms of this top circle, you can see, and we're producing a lot of carbon dioxide equivalents, about 450,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents to produce nearly 20,000 kilograms of live weight. And if you then convert some of that land into woodlands, so 10%, 20%, 30, 40, and 50%, you can see you can move towards net zero. So you can offset that carbon associated with that beef production, and 40% of that woodland of that land converted to woodland would completely offset. And if you convert half of that, so still producing meat, but you convert half of it to woodland, you're actually being a net sink. But you could argue actually that how economically viable would that farm be? So you also need to look at increases and find this sweet spot. So as I said, we can select animals through improvements. You know, the agricultural industry and the livestock sector is not standing still. It's improving all the time. So if you look at increasing productivity on those farms at 10, 20 and 30% under each of these increasing woodland scenarios, you can see that you can increase live weight gain for either the same or a reduced amount of carbon dioxide equivalents. So what is that sweet spot? Well, I say a productivity improvement of 20% is perfectly achievable in a short period of time. A woodland cover of 20% would still give economically viable farms, could result in a 70% reduction in greenhouse gas and retain 96% of productivity. That's a pathway under ELMS and under our new agricultural systems that we can move towards net zero beef, producing high quality meat for lower greenhouse gas emissions and still be part of supporting rural communities and part of a healthy food system. I won't spend long talking about this, but just to emphasize this, and Peter did say, you know, carbon dioxide equivalence is used, which converts all greenhouse gases to carbon dioxide. But of course, methane behaves very differently. And a fair reflection of the flow pollutant that methane is in terms of its residence time in the atmosphere would be to adopt something like GWP star, which takes into account that methane is breaking down. And therefore, if you're reducing methane on your farm, which I've shown you can do, you could actually contribute to global cooling and not global warming through livestock systems. But you still have to reduce methane. But because it turns over quicker than nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide, it could reduce emissions. So therefore, livestock and particularly ruminant farms can be part of the solution to net zero. But we have to reduce the amount of methane we produce. So the other area, and I think it's probably more pertinent to this audience specifically, is that what is a kilogram of product? You know, Pete showed that the graph, and so did I, in terms of Ripple's diagram comparing beef against peas and beans and chicken. But we all know that these different protein sources have different nutritional values. So what I've done on this slide is to have a look at the some protein sources from livestock products which make up the Eat Well guide and consider the key nutrients of why those protein sources are on that Eat Well guide because of their protein content, their monounsaturated fatty acids, their long chain EPA and DHA. And I'm not saying that the best source of long-chain omega-3 is red meat. Of course, it's oily fish, but we don't eat enough oily fish. So therefore, contribution from these sources is beneficial. And then some micronutrients and some vitamins, but also some negative components. That should be sodium chloride, and saturated fatty acids. And if you have a look at the RDI, the recommended daily intake of these key nutrients, and then the amounts that the 100-gram serving of these animal-based proteins will provide. And if you then summarize those key nutrients and you compare the carbon dioxide equivalents, not in terms of kilograms of product, but percentage RDI that those foods contain, you will actually show that beef has a lower carbon footprint than chicken or pork. And when you include plant-based proteins, because of increased bioavailability, it reduces that differential, which Peter mentioned, between 10 and 100 to around about 0.5 to 2. So a significant reduction in the difference because of the better nutrient density of the animal-based products. So we need to take into account the nutritional value and not just the weight when we're allocating environmental burden. That's critically important. So just moving on, and Peter mentioned this as well, of course, sustainability is more than just carbon. And we have to move away from global averages. As good as Clark and Tillman's paper is, it's based on global averages. And all those environmental parameters that they emphasize is not related to specific production systems. So we need to consider all aspects of sustainability in the specific regions that the different types of production systems are attributed to. And I think central to all the aspects of sustainability, and Peter will be very happy I've said this, is soil health. And this was some work which was carried out at Rothamsted Research, which is actually looking using the long-term experiments to show the importance of soil organic carbon in sustainable farming systems and the role that livestock can play in returning carbon into arable farms, which are degraded in terms of the amount of carbon. So I think there's a vital role in terms of mixed agricultural systems for ruminants to play, whether that be sheep grazing aftermath or sheep grazing cover crops to return soil health to arable farms, or whether it be the movement of farmyard manure from dairy farms into arable farms to return slurries. Because the best, healthiest soils are grasslands. A lot of them have reached plateau in terms of carbon, but let's start to remove that brown gold, that organic matter coming out the backside of these animals into arable soils. So as part of a circular economy. This is a snapshot of data coming from the Northwick Farm platform, because if you advocate the removal of ruminant livestock from food systems, to replace that protein, you're going to have to convert some grassland into arable production, and particularly into some protein crop productions. So that will take grassland out of production. It would have to be cultivated, and therefore the loss of nutrients from the turnover of those grasslands needs to be counted as part of that sustainability indicator for the loss of ruminants. So this slide actually shows the loss in suspended sediment when you convert a typical grassland in green into an arable system in orange. This is one storm event showing the loss of suspended sediment. And this is not taking into account of the analysis of what will happen if you remove livestock from rural communities. The other important component, and I think this is my second to last slide, Jenny, is about other important metrics of sustainability. Peter flagged up in the Clark and Tillman paper the amount of land use. But what we have to define, of course, is the amount of arable land use. And if one of the most important parameters for sustainability is biodiversity, we do not want any more agricultural land encroaching into the Amazon, the steppes, the Pampinas, all that rich biodiverse land. So that will basically mean we can't have any more agricultural land. If we can't have any more agricultural land, and we have a growing population, the only way we're going to feed a growing population is to use that agricultural land more sustainably. And that will mean growing crops to feed humans, not animals. So totally agree with Peter's standpoint on that. But this emphasizes the vital role that ruminants can play in delivering key nutrition, because they can utilize lands which are not suitable for growing crops, i.e. arable land, and they are a perfect converter of waste streams from the food industry. And continually undermining ruminant production systems is detrimental to future sustainability. And some work that I've been working on with Imke de Boer and the groups at Wageningen is to say, I agree tightly with Peter, we overconsume. We need to reduce the amount that we eat. And therefore, if you think about the balance on average of the amount of protein we need about 60 grams. And that can be all from plants or all from livestock. So where is that sweet spot in terms of the amount? And that's what I've got on the x-axis here. And if you look at an important indicator of sustainability, which is arable land use, you will actually show that zero protein from livestock is detrimental to sustainability, because we're taking away the unique advantage that ruminants have of utilizing non-arable land resources and utilizing byproducts. So we need to find that sweet spot for the role that ruminant systems have in food systems. So the final slide, just to emphasize that livestock are more than just food. They're a vital component of many, many different aspects. I don't agree with what George Monbiot is saying. I think we have got a green and beautiful, pleasant land. And I actually think rural communities supporting that and the need for ruminant-based livestock systems and not using global averages will help support these environments and these communities. And I think that's a beautiful picture in the left-hand side. In many parts of the world, livestock are a vital part of traction, keeping us away from fossil fuel use, which is the major thing that we need to focus on. And this cloud of focusing on livestock and particularly ruminant systems is moving away from what we should be emphasizing, which is carbon dioxide emissions. We need to rediscover natural fibers, be they plant or livestock, and wean ourselves off plastics. I think that's critically important. Livestock products are everywhere, and so they should be. If an animal is given its life for sustenance, we should make sure we utilize every component of that. And therefore, it's wrong to assume that a plant-based solution is always the most environmentally friendly. Take, for example, palm oil. Palm oil came in increasing in existence because we wanted to strip out stearate, lard, an animal byproduct from certain products so we could put a vegetarian logo on it. So we are losing the orangutans because we want to use an unsustainable plant resource instead of a sustainable animal fat, which is a waste stream. So that is not environmental friendly move of a plant-based direction. So don't always consider plant being environmentally benign and livestock being environmentally detrimental. There are many examples where a livestock byproduct is more sustainable than a plant-based alternative. I've already mentioned the vital role in terms of soil health. And my final picture here, I've been lucky enough to work in Africa on many subsistence farms which have these little, they call them their bio ATMs because they don't have bank accounts, basically these goat animals. And when climate means that their crops fail, they've still got these animals to support their families. And some analysis that we've done at the University of Bristol and at the University of Queen's Belfast and at Rothamsted has shown that in terms of the socioeconomics of these subsistence families, the single most important determinant to say that a child is fed and educated, the women have control of the purse in terms of looking after the family group, which is a really important indicator. Those three most important indicators, the most driving factor is the presence of a goat. So the importance of livestock within those systems, and particularly ruminant livestock. Okay, that's my final slide. Thank you, Jenny.
Great, thank you. And thank you for both of you to putting a pitch together. Pete, do you want to just quickly come back on some of the things that Michael has said?
The joys of going second.
There's a danger of agreement breaking out accidentally. I think we agree that I'm not saying we need to completely abolish livestock products. But I think Michael's great example, where he showed, 20% of afforestation of the farm and increasing productivity, and also coupled with demand reduction, that would be a sustainable way to go. So I think we both agree actually that we overconsume. So I'm taking out where we agree that we overconsume. We agree that we need to cut livestock product consumption. We agree that there will probably still be a role to play in future food systems. So finding that sweet spot, as Michael called it, is a great way to go. The one thing I disagree on is the statement that we'll need to plough up grasslands if we're going to feed people. 48% of all crops that we consume within the UK are fed to animals. So we could actually use that arable land to feed ourselves more effectively using plant-based proteins without actually going into any of the grasslands. So that's the only area of disagreement, I think. I think we give different pitches, but I think that there's sort of the compromise is there in the middle.
Yep. That's probably a fair comment. Do you want to say anything, Michael?
Yeah. No,
do you agree?
So, I suppose just comment on the conversion of grasslands. Some of that is based on socioeconomics, not demand. If you take a farmer out of livestock production, some of those farmers are going to still want to be farmers, and their only way would be conversion. So I take your point about livestock production. I think that's right, and I totally agree with that. You know, we feed our animals incorrectly at the moment, and that needs to be a major change. But they can be a key component, and that's the great thing about ruminants. I suppose where we differ, Pete and I, most is this continual utilization of global averages. And I just really think that undermines improvement practices. Keep on rolling out 50 to 60 when it bears no resemblance to what's happening on the ground, and no resemblance to the hard work that the agricultural industry is going to move towards net zero, and not actually showing that those are flexible. And actually, it's not always ruminant livestock that are going to be detrimental. Then that's where I suppose we differ the most.
Yeah, I completely agree, Michael, that those global averages subsume a whole load of detail. But you know, even with 15 tons of CO2 equivalents per year, that's nowhere near as low as you get for plant-based protein. So, okay, it's not 60, but it's still 15, and that's still way higher than plant-based protein. The reason that Poor and Nemechek did their original analysis was to look and see how much variation there was between production systems of the same product. And whilst they found that there was sort of maybe an order of magnitude difference in the different production systems, the difference between different products still remains, and that's uncontrovertible. I think we agree on that.
Yeah, absolutely. But where I was very disappointed in the Poor and Nemechek paper, and also the Eat Lancet report, is that they didn't include bioavailability, they didn't include DS, they didn't account for nutritional value. And if you do that, as I said, say, for example, you take tofu versus beef, you will actually found the environmental footprint drops dramatically, about 0.5. And that doesn't even include the complexity, out of which and that broad brush approach, unfortunately, Poor and Nemechek didn't take into account. Although I agree with you, yeah, it's a great bit of a starting point analysis. I just wish it had emphasized the fact that you do need to take into account nutritional quality when you're comparing pea protein with beef protein.